Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the JPN 39 Plus podcast, where we explore the halachic considerations for observant healthcare professionals.
Before we begin, we'd like to extend a special congratulations to Rabbi Yosef Sprung, the rabbinic editor of this project, for his new appointment as rabbinic authority and Rav of Shaare Tzedek Hospital in Yerushalayim. Lastly, as always, we thank Chemed Health Center for sponsoring the 39 Plus series and supporting Jewish physicians everywhere to excel professionally and also in their Torah study.
In this episode, we're going to be discussing traveling to and from the hospital on Shabbos. Traveling to and from clinical settings can be a major halachic challenge for residents or attendings. While pikuach nefesh is an overriding principle in Hilchos Shabbos, traveling to and from pre-scheduled shifts or taking calls in halachic sense does not seem to be directly related to patient care, as clinicians working in the hospital setting could theoretically remain in the hospital over Shabbos, avoiding whatever malachic traveling would require. Therefore, this presents an issue that we really need to discuss.
We're going to summarize the relevant halachic opinions regarding what contexts would allow for travel. Then we're going to explore the halachic status of different methods of travel, which each use different forms of halachic work or malacha. This podcast should never be viewed as a substitute for personal rabbinic advice. We hope that the content will be relevant, background knowledge for when a person presents a question that they may have to a Rav that's competent in these areas for their advice navigating these issues.
Within this audio and within the text that it will be provided, we've categorized the way poskim generally model travel on Shabbos in four following themes. So one is commuting to the hospital for an emergency case. Two, commuting to the hospital for a scheduled shift. Three, returning home from an emergency case. And four, returning from the hospital from a scheduled shift.
So first, we're going to discuss commuting to the hospital for an emergent case. The halachic principle of pikuach nefesh, as we discussed before, or preservation of life, overrides the laws of Shabbos. Therefore, the Shulchan Aruch widely rules that it's a mitzvah to desecrate the Shabbos for life-threatening illness. This would also include traveling to Shabbos to treat a patient whose life is in danger. For this reason, emergency responders who have no way of knowing if there will be an emergency or where an emergency will occur may do any malachas necessary to respond as quickly as possible, including driving to the responding site. On the other hand, a physician or any healthcare worker has far greater certainty regarding where they will be called to preserve life, usually a clinical hospital setting. Additionally, unlike the emergency responder, there's usually a greater confidence about whether they will be called in, as it's easy to gauge how many weekend calls come in a particular clinical practice or setting. For this reason, unlike other community organizations like Hatzalah or even a private doula, there is an honest halacha question as to whether a clinician on call must remain in the hospital from the start of Shabbos to respond to hospital calls, which we will have to deal with each separately. If the call is infrequent enough and there's real possibility the physician will not be called in for Shabbos, this matter would be more akin to the case and the precedent of emergency responders.
So going to the hospital on Shabbos or really responding to an emergency would be okay, as in the case of Hatzalah. And so in our case, where we have clinicians responding to emergencies, such as they're on call, we could potentially model it the same way that we look at Hatzalah responding to an emergency. But there is slight nuance in the sense that clinicians know that they're going to be on call and know they'll have to likely respond to emergencies. And so potentially maybe they would be required to be in the hospital on Shabbos before it even starts. Maybe they're responsible to be in the hospital before Shabbos starts, as to not have to violate any malachos.
Yeah, so it's kind of that spectrum. A higher degree of certainty that you're going to have to be in a clinical setting would make this precedent, in this case, less analogous to the case of Hatzalah. But the more infrequent the chance of you getting called in, the more analogous this would be to the case of Hatzalah. So the second thing we're going to discuss, and really, the second thing that you'll find in the Paskim, is commuting to the hospital for a scheduled shift or a frequent knowable call. Halachic authorities differ in opinion on how physicians should model the halachic issue of commuting to a scheduled shift or even a fairly certain call requirement. Rebecca Feinstein in Igros Moshe holds that a physician traveling to shift must live within walking distance of the hospital, even if this means that they will be forced to rent a separate Shabbos residence and/or will be away from their family and community and unable to perform the positive mitzvot of Shabbos, such as Kiddush, the Suda, the Minyan. He gives no dispensation for this sort of case. Rav Zalman Auerbach, on the other hand, in his work, Shulchan Shlema, and really comes up in a few other places that he's quoted, argues that there is no halachic requirement per se to avoid malachas of Shabbos that are required for the sake of pikuach nefesh. He models the responding of a physician to a pikuach nefesh situation on Shabbos, even for a scheduled shift. He models that as a tremendous mitzvah and posits that one is never obligated to avoid a mitzvah in any other context. Therefore, he rules that a physician may stay at home every Friday night, and when required to be involved in the midst of pikuach nefesh, that's to say, when they're required to show up to their shift, they may commute to their shift. However, he rules that it would be appropriate and respectful of the spirit of Shabbos to use a non-Jewish driver for the commute and avoid biblical prohibitions. Or if this situation is only infrequent, and on those rare Shabbosim that he does have to have a scheduled shift, they should make an effort to be within walking distance of the hospital.
So according to Rishon Zalman, a scheduled shift would be equal to responding to an emergency, whereas according to Moshe Feinstein, one would really need to make necessary preemptive measures as to not violate other forms of laws.
Yeah, so the difference is the way they look at it. Moshe Feinstein looks at responding to or being involved with pikuach nefesh on Shabbos. He sees that as what's contemporary called dechuya. That's to say, it's not ideal. Obviously, a person should preserve life. It overrides Shabbos. We're not happy that it overrides Shabbos. Rosh Zalman Auerbach takes a very different approach. And he says, while we do say dechuya, and a person should try to limit the isurim involved, being involved with pikuach nefesh itself is a mitzvah that doesn't require a person to go out of their way. This is a kind of an interesting argument and a novel interpretation of Rosh Zalman that's very widely accepted. But the exact technicalities of it and the scope of the literature that's written about it is beyond the scope of this work.
I'll just make mention, this seems to be the same point we've made in regarding taking a non-Shomer Shabbos residency in the first place. And so for anyone listening to this that hasn't heard that background, it may be worthwhile to take a listen to that, as it kind of revolves around the same machlokas.
The next theme that we're going to discuss is returning home from an emergent case. The question of returning from an emergent case or call on Shabbos is more nuanced. Returning home is not a matter of pikuach nefesh. Medical staff could theoretically remain in the hospital until after Shabbos. However, if that were required, there would be a genuine concern that people would refrain from being as diligent in responding to emergencies, at least subconsciously. We are concerned halachically about the presence of this bias against responding to emergencies due to the tremendous inconvenience of being stranded in the hospital for the remainder of Shabbos. Shulchan Aruch brings a similar reasoning when discussing the case of a militia responding to aggressors, stating in the language of the Shulchan Aruch is that people who go out to save lives on Shabbos may return with their weapons on Shabbos. Mishnah Berurah adds the reasoning for, if not, they would consider not doing so again in the future. The scope of this permissiveness, however, is a matter of deep disagreement amongst the Rishonim and the Achronim. This controversy can still be found in the rulings of modern rabbinic authorities, as we will discuss. Shabbos Zalman Auerbach and the Minchas Shlomo and Tzitz Eliezer, both reading this Gemara and reading this precedent of the militia, broaden the scope of the ruling and apply this to clinicians returning from emergencies. This seems to be in accordance with the Magen Avraham before them, who permits Isur D'Rabbanan in returning from the hospital. According to this reasoning, driving home or enlisting a Jewish driver, whereby biblical prohibitions would be violated, would be strictly forbidden. However, a mode of travel that would only violate rabbinic prohibitions, such as enlisting the services of a non-Jew to drive him home, or biking or using electric vehicles, as we will discuss, would be permitted. Moshe Feinstein, in a novel responsa, permits even the violation of Isur D'Oraisa in returning from the hospital from an emergency setting, echoing the ruling of the Chasam Sofer, who holds that returning from life-threatening emergencies may even violate Isur D'Oraisa.
So the point of contention here is, when you're finished with the emergency, can we be as maple as we were when you were responding to the emergency? So going to the emergency, pikuach nefesh, we said you could really do even Isur D'Oraisa, but the question is, returning home from that, what can you do? And it seems that everyone agrees that D'Rabbanan would be allowed, but Moshe Feinstein goes as far as to say that you can even do a D'Oraisa.
Yeah, and this sort of schism, you could find it in the Rishonim in the earlier applications of the interpretation of this Gemara. You can also see it in the Achronim and now in the contemporary Paskin. It's worth knowing that there is a third, more stringent opinion that really says that we can't use this precedent. That's an honest and relevant halachic opinion by Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank in the Har Tzvi, but a full discussion of his opinion is beyond the scope of this work. The next theme that we're going to discuss is returning home from the hospital from a scheduled shift. The response to literature raises two reservations about using the exact legal mechanism for clinicians returning home for Shabbos from scheduled shifts. Firstly, since these shifts are paid for, or at least necessary for clinicians to retain their appointments, there is less of a concern for patient safety that residents and medical staff will fail to respond to making the shift. Therefore, the concern for bias against being present in the hospital doesn't apply in this context, unlike the previous case of coming home from responding to an emergency case. Secondly, even if it were feasible for all Shabbos observant clinicians to avoid Shabbos shifts, the likelihood that it would be that it would ultimately endanger patient care is less prominent, especially in countries that do not have a Jewish majority of clinicians. Notwithstanding this hesitation, many poskim ultimately do conclude that a Isur D'Rabbanan could be waived to allow medical staff to return home even after their scheduled shift. This, while contentious, is in line with generations of rabbanim and physicians, and a psak that was recorded in Nishmas Avram and the Minchas Asher, Rabbi Willig in a recording on the JPN, and Rabbi Abful on a recording on the JPN.
So just based on what we're saying, even returning home from a scheduled shift, there's room to say that that's allowed with Darabans.
Yeah. So, using a biblical, being over a kind of like a biblical prohibition wouldn't be allowed, but a rabbinic prohibition would be allowed. So we've kind of been skirting around this. We're saying that certain contexts allow for biblical prohibitions, certain contexts allow for rabbinic prohibitions, but we haven't really discussed each individual mode of travel. So now we're going to look at 5 different forms of travel on Shabbos, rate their relative severity, understanding the halachic mechanisms and modeling that we use to understand them. Keep in mind that it's not only the mode of travel that's relevant halakhically, but also the area in which one travels and the distance within or outside the city that one travels, as we'll discuss. This conversation is a bit technical, and getting to what rabbinically, is what rabbinically prohibited versus what's biblically prohibited is very relevant for analyzing where halakha is more lenient for clinicians traveling for patient care and less lenient.
There's also a summary of this table in the printed version with an unfilled version that you can fill out for yourself before discussing matters with your Rav, so that way you kind of know where you're coming from when you have these questions with your individual Rav.
All right, so the first mode of travel that we're going to discuss is riding a bicycle, biking. Biking on Shabbos in an area that's surrounded by an area is generally prohibited because of, in other contexts, because of Din Dechol. It's not in the spirit of Shabbos. It's a lesser violation than a normal Isur D'Rabbanan. In an area that is not surrounded by an area, however, it is additionally a form of carrying, violating the Melacha B'Tzah. In a modern context, this may only be considered an Isur D'Rabbanan, as many poskim argue that most modern cities do not count as a biblical Isur Rabbin, making carrying only rabbinically prohibited. It's important to note, however, whether or not local city streets constitute a biblical Isur Rabbin is an honest question for local authorities, better informed of the on-the-ground reality.
So, as I imagine, many of us will need to cross major city streets to get to the hospital. This is typically the case. It seems like there's real room to consider this a D'Rabbanan, and there's real room to consider this a Rishus Harabim, in which case the question is a matter of whether it's D'Oraisa, D'Rabbanan, biblical or rabbinical, in which case it seems like for biking specifically, it would really be worthwhile to discuss this with your individual Rav as to whether or not, is this rabbinic in origin or biblical.
Yeah, and when presenting this question to the Rav, you'll also need to go over the exact route that you'll need to take. And it's important that this be a Rav that really understands the city in which you live. So the next mode of travel that we're going to discuss is electric vehicles. The halachic status of an electric scooter, a moped, or an electric car on Shabbos would be a question, really, principally, of how we model the usage of electric devices in general on Shabbos. Poskim from the previous generation wrestled with this matter extensively. Depending on the pasuk, the use of electricity on Shabbos can be categorized either as an Isur D'Oraisa, or D'Rabbanan. According to Shabbos Zalman Auerbach, clinicians may be lenient concerning the use of electricity on Shabbos and relies on the opinion that it's only an Isur D'Rabbanan when necessary. This view is widely accepted among modern poskim. Rav Asher Weiss, who typically posits the usage of electricity on Shabbos is a biblical prohibition, also considers it acceptable to rely on this lenient opinion of Rosh Zalman Auerbach in the interest of patient care. With this in mind, the use of electric vehicles would violate rabbinic prohibitions and not biblically prohibited.
And just to clarify, the potential issue we discussed about whether it's biblical or rabbinical based on whether or not it's a Rishus Harabim or not is not applicable in this case because it's a different Isser, meaning that was a question of Hotzah, and that's relevant as to whether or not this is a Rishus Harabim or not, and this is not a question of Hotzah, and so therefore we can pretty confidently say across the board this is just a matter of whether or not electricity is D'Oraisa D'Rabbanan, and even of those who say it's D'Oraisa for patient care, we can say it's D'Rabbanan. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, and this takes us to our next mode of transportation, the use of public transportation. The use of public transportation, like a bus or a train, in a non-Jewish majority country or city is prohibited because, again, of the act of Din Dechol, as we discussed before. Provided that the driver and most passengers are not Jewish, even the general rabbinic prohibition against the Amir al-Nachri, the giving of commands or directions to non-Jew on Shabbos to violate Shabbos practice for a Jew, even that Amir al-Nachri would not apply. However, practically, using public transportation entails other issues, entails carrying some form of payment and performing monetary transactions, adding two rabbinic prohibitions in an area with no Eruv, or potentially an Asud Deraisa if the place is Rosh Hashanah Deraisa. It's therefore recommended to wear. It's also recommended to wear a garment that signifies why one is commuting on Shabbos, such as scrubs or a white coat, avoiding Maras Ayin, or the rabbinic issue of the appearance of not keeping Shabbos, which is also rabbinically frowned upon. It's prohibited in certain circumstances and is generally considered a lesser rabbinic prohibition. The next mode of travel, the next thing that we're going to discuss is using a taxi or an Uber. The halachic issue surrounding the ordering of a non-Jewish Uber taxi on Shabbos would be a rabbinic prohibition of Amir al-Nachri. There is a possibility that your driver could be Jewish, but on the whole, the Rav, the majority of cases, your driver will not be Jewish in a non-Jewish majority country. Therefore, it's safe to assume that your driver is not Jewish. It's worth noting that an Uber, especially if the Uber is pre-scheduled, would be the most ideal version of travel, as in that case, there's no transaction taking place, which really limits this whole matter to a very controlled Amir al-Nachri. The next and last mode of travel, which is by far the most halachically problematic, is the usage of an internal combustion engine, which is the most problematic form of transportation that we've discussed. Using an ICE vehicle, internal combustion engine, is lighting a fire, which is biblically prohibited due to the malach of habara, lighting a fire. When driving a car, the engine burns gas as you drive, making each gas pedal usage an additional forbidden activity. General note. We've discussed different modes of travel. Now, as we alluded to before and foreshadowed, it's not only a matter of how you're traveling, but also when this takes us to the concept of Shabbos. Shabbos, that's to the limit for how far one is allowed to travel in Shabbos, is generally defined as 2,000 amma, approximately 3/4 of a mile or 1.2 kilometers, from the last dwelling in one's town's periphery. So, in other words, there's an issue not only with traveling, but there's an issue in traveling outside of the boundaries of your city. Most opinions hold the issue of traveling further than 2,000 amas, 1.2 kilometers, is rabbinic, while venturing over a distance of over 12 mil is potentially biblically prohibited. The Mishnah Berurah and Reb Chaim Noah ruled that an amma is equal to 48 centimeters. Therefore, 2,000 amas equals 960 meters, which is about 0.6 miles. Beger's Maisha states that an amma is 21.25 inches long. According to this opinion, 2,000 amas would be about a little over a kilometer, 1,079 meters, which is about 2/3 of a mile. It's important to note that there are many nuances and exceptions to the rules of Tchum Shabbos. It's best to consult with a rabbinic or halachic authority for guidance regarding specific situation and commute. However, it is worth noting that this is really an issue in metropolitan areas.
So, in conclusion, just to wrap everything up, the different modes of travel vary in the malachos that one would potentially need to violate. The types of situations and contexts largely dictate what methods of travel are permitted for clinicians to use on Shabbos. However, it's important to note that efforts are always required to minimize the Yisurim involved when you're potentially going to have to violate Shabbos. So we can break it down into the various categories. We have unforeseeable emergencies. This is what we think of when you think of Hatzalah. There's an emergency call and they go. In this scenario, one can even do a malacha d'oraisa, biblical prohibition, and drive directly to the scene. You have returning from an unforeseeable emergency, so returning from the Hatzalah call. It's widely accepted amongst poskim that one can return using a derabanan mode of travel. You have foreseeable emergencies, such as you're on call or even just going to your shift. Commuting to a foreseeable emergency or scheduled shift is a matter of disagreement between Rav Moshe and Rav Shlomo Zalman as to whether or not one can even do a deraisa. The latter is more lenient, recommending rabbinic malacha such as Amir al-Nachri. Returning from a foreseeable emergency, as well as returning from a scheduled shift, most authorities allow the usage of method of travel that only violate rabbinical prohibitions, such as using public transportation, electric vehicles, or taxis that employ Amir al-Nachri. And some considerations is that the poskim of previous generations argue about whether the following leniencies should or should not be used routinely. And surely there's a large and sensitive hashkafic component that really needs to be discussed. And so we really encourage everyone to discuss it with their individual Rav. It's also important to keep in mind that many of these rulings were issued in Israel, where the majority of clinicians and patients are themselves Shabbos observant, and therefore they would not be able to rely on non-Jewish physicians, whereas in the United States, that's not the case, and so perhaps some of these rulings would differ. And then additionally, it's important to consider the relevance of these halachas by the various medical specialties. And so what we really recommend is this topic should be discussed on a case-by-case basis with your individual trusted rabbinic authority. But we hope that this video and the chart that will be provided gives you some background to be able to approach this discussion in the most productive way.